welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon. Great to be here. And welcome, everyone, to this podcast on shared reading. And a very warm welcome to our special guest, Diane Snowball. Diane is an accomplished educator with many years' experience teaching in the classroom, professionally developing teachers and leaders in Australia and overseas with significant results. Hi, Di. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Phil. How are you going today?
Not too bad. And what have you been up to lately?
Well, I don't know, I seem to be too busy. Yesterday I was working in a wonderful school in Melbourne, Elstonwick Primary School, who have been doing great work under their principal, Michael Pitaro, for quite a few years now. So I love working there. And I was particularly happy about what I was doing yesterday because I was working with 3 grade 1 teachers, and they all wanted to know more about shared reading, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So it was great. I was able to observe them. They wanted me to watch and give them some feedback. And so that's a terrific thing to do. I can let them know what they're doing well and what we're going to work on. And we'll have some time on Friday. I'll have a whole day with them. That's how good the principal is, to really get stuck into understanding what it's all about, what goes with it, and anything else that's connected, what sort of teaching they can be doing. All sorts of little things that come up, just observing them, that I probably might not remember to speak about even today if I hadn't observed that yesterday.
Which leads me into, we always try to identify what the teaching struggle is, and I guess it is that sometimes teachers aren't sure about shared reading, or sometimes they haven't used it and don't know about it, or they're not sure how to use it effectively.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
And it's not their fault. You know, these teachers are all relatively new to teaching. In fact, for one, this is her first year in teaching, and the others have only had a couple of years of teaching. And unless they actually saw this practice being used in schools they were in while they were undergraduates, and even if they saw it, it may not have been done properly. And I'll say properly because there really are some quite specific things about shared reading that matter. And so if they haven't had that opportunity, there's no reason why they would know about it, except that they know it, they've heard about it, they know it's something that they should be doing, and they're having a go at it, and so good on them, and they want to learn more. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, because we were talking to a young teacher on our podcast last week who has only been teaching a couple of years, and she said at university they give you a broad overview of literacy, but you don't get down to some of the specifics like these tips and tools and techniques that you could use. You know, it needs to be developed over your teaching career, doesn't it? Yeah.
And, you know, and something like shared reading's not tip or a tool or whatever, which they can be very important, all the nitty-gritty stuff. But this is a sort of major understanding about how children learn to read. You know, so it's sort of a very important part of children learning to read, that we need to understand the principles behind it, the philosophy behind it, and some of the exact practices that make it effective or not. So it requires, you know, a bit of study, but certainly understanding what it was really intended for is important.
It's great you clarified that because, yeah, it's not like an add-on or some sort of thing you can use in a lesson. There's a lot more to it. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. So should we get on with some questions today?
Yeah, sure.
So the first one is, what is shared reading? What's it all about?
Well, the word shared is obviously an important part of that title. It's because it's the sharing of reading something between the teacher and the children. And in the home situation, it's the child and the parent, or the children and the parent. And the parent would start by reading, and if it's the sort of book that the children like and ask to be read often, then it's read so many times the child starts to join in with the reading. And so that's where it came from, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. That's why it's called shared reading. It's because in a classroom situation, a teacher has a large enough book that the children can actually see all of the print. It's got to be large enough for them to see it and read along with it, and to see what the teacher is reading. So when the teacher does the reading, first of all, then the children can actually see the words that the teacher is reading. And the teacher would help those children, particularly beginning readers, by tracking along with a long, thin pointer. And so the children are already starting to understand the concept of a word and that one-to-one match between what is on the page and what you say. But it's got to be large enough text for all of the children to be joining in with or observing what the teacher is actually reading. And when they do that together, then it's shared reading. So it's one text that they're all looking at. That's a very important basic aspect of it.
So it's like if you had one child with you and you're both looking at a book together, you can easily see that book, but
yes,
it's making it that same idea, but making it for a whole class to share with you what's happening on that book.
Exactly. And that came about because the original researcher and practitioner of all of this work on shared reading, back in the 1960s and early 1970s, Don Holdaway in New Zealand was observing that Maori children who came to school without experience with print, because their stories were passed down to them orally, were not starting out with the same understandings of what text is about as children who had had experience with books at home. And so he wanted to learn a lot more quite specifically about what the books at home being read to the children by their parents was all about. Not just that it was a nice experience, but what exactly was going on. And he wanted to know that because he wanted to emulate that in classrooms, in particular at the start, to help these children who'd not had experience with text. You know, it's all based on that idea of a parent with a child and they can both see the book. And he realised if that was going to happen in a classroom, then the book had to be large and the print had to be large. And unfortunately, a number of publishers thought that the idea of books suitable for shared reading was just to enlarge the book. So they would take a wonderful book like one of the ones being read yesterday was Possum Magic and just enlarge it, but the print was still very small.
Yeah.
I can remember they even did it with The Very Hungry Caterpillar, fabulous text type to use for shared reading, but they left the print so small that children, even just sitting at the back of a little group in the room, couldn't see the words.
Which shows that some of the publishers didn't have the fundamental idea of what this was about.
No, that's right. And at the time that the first big books were published, Scholastic was actually Ashton's in Australia, and they became Ashton Scholastic. And they were actually working with Don Holdaway, and that's how the first big books were published, because they could see the work he was doing in New Zealand. Their company was in New Zealand as well. And so he was able to tell them exactly what the books needed to be like.
Which leads on to the next question, which is what else is essential for text to be suitable for shared reading?
Well, they have to be worth reading. So that, again, that was a mistake that some publishers made. They thought you could just enlarge any book because it was a big book, it was suitable for shared reading. But in fact, the first big books that were published back there in about 1974 were called the Read It Again series, because the texts that were being chosen were such that if you read them to a class, someone in the class would immediately say, read it again. So they were the sort of material, in those days, firstly, stories that children wanted to hear again and again. Now, again, that's what Don Holdaway was observing in the parent reading situation, that there were particular books that children ask to be read over and over again.
Yeah.
And if you've ever had that experience with your own children at home, then you know they want them read so often the parents actually get sick of reading the same book.
Yeah, I know those books. And they often have rhyme in them, and they have repetition and rhythm.
They did. In fact, it was sort of like they always had parts of them that the children could easily remember and start joining in. And that was one of the things that Don Holdaway perceived as being very important, that the child perceived themselves as a reader very early on. And, you know, this can happen when children are 2 years old. And even before they might be saying the words, they sort of go along with the rhythm. And they might go, dun, 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 da, 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 dun, da, 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 da. And it's different rhythm to when we're just talking orally. So
that
they were picking up on that whole rhythm and repetition of them.
That happened with our kids. They definitely did that right from, 2 or 3. And, they were reading the books with us, and gradually they started to read the words properly.
Yes, and see, that's the advantage of it being a book that the kids want over and over again. Then they're becoming very familiar with the words, and first of all, they're probably just memorising them. And, they don't even need the book to look at, and they know if you leave out a page or anything. But then they're seeing the same print with the same thing that they're saying over and over again, and they actually do start to pick up some of the words, not necessarily only the high-frequency words, but very interesting words, like in Pamela Allen's Who Sank the Boat. On the first page, I think it is, says, one day for no particular reason, Mr. can't remember his name, decided to go for a row in the bay. Particularly was a word that they would pick up as being very interesting and would remember. And, that's a very long sentence, but they would still be able to remember it and read it. And, as we were saying, they will pick up specific words and start to recognise them. So they're developing all these wonderful concepts about print, left to right, top to bottom, the concept of a word, a sentence, even hearing the sort of phrasing and expression we use when we're reading that's not like a robot. So all of that was very important, but it was because the text was worth reading and the children wanted it over and over again. So when I help teachers in schools go through their big book collection, we actually sort out the ones that are suitable for shared reading and those that aren't.
Which leads into the next question, questions to ask when choosing books for shared reading.
Well, number one, is the text, the story or the non-fiction worth reading, and will the children enjoy it and want it more than once, that they'll want it read over and over again. 2, that it will then have some aspect about it, and it might be rhyme, it might be some repetitive phrase, but it's not simple. I don't mean it's a book like I like apples, I like pears, I like whatever, because, that's blah, blah.
It's got to be
if you read it once, let alone read it a second time. It has its purpose, but it's not for shared reading. But it will have those sort of strong elements that kids will want to talk about. There's something really interesting going on. Young children at home will actually take books out of parents' hands, turn back pages, point out things, make comments, ask questions, all the things that a really effective reader does. And so we want it to be that sort of book in the classroom.
So, Di, this is why poetry and songs are such a winner? Nursery rhymes?
Absolutely. And in fact, I can remember being on a plane on the way back from an Australian Reading Conference in Perth and thinking to myself, do you know what? There's no big book of nursery rhymes. And so I actually went to a publisher, it was Thomas Nelson at the time, and we put together the first book of nursery rhymes, knowing how much children love chanting along with those. And it was called Time for a Rhyme, and then we did Time for a Number Rhyme. And so it's interesting that until then there hadn't been a big book of the rhymes, but of course it was very, very suitable. And that's why it's so easy for teachers to actually produce material themselves that they could use for shared reading. It doesn't have to be a bought one. And, it's very hard to find really good big books to buy these days. For some reason, publishers are not producing them. And the really great ones are not around anymore to buy even.
Well, it's understanding the learning philosophy underneath it, and when you don't know that, you don't have a reason for publishing something like that.
Exactly.
You know? Yeah.
And, a lot of the really great ones, publishers could go back and reprint them. So, all that development costs wouldn't be there. But I remember when Don Holdaway came over from New Zealand, and he actually came to where I was working, and it was a professional development centre for teachers. And he actually had with him big books that he and a colleague, Libby Handy, had made. They had just got large chart paper, made sure the print was large when they were writing it. They did some illustrations. In classrooms, I've had children do the illustrations for the text. It's a really good comprehension activity, actually, to understand what needs to be in the illustrations. And then they would put that together and they were making their own big books. And I remember he was using sort of a retelling of common fairy tales because they had all those elements in them that were really important. Kids want them to be read more than once. They have a good storyline. They often have some element of repetition. There are features of the story that become very common across fairy tales. So he was producing his own in classrooms probably long before there were published ones. And if it's difficult to buy them, make your own. And poetry and songs would be so easy for you to do, and to give the copies of those to the children they can have their own independent copy to read. Because when the first big books were published, they were always produced with 4 or 6 small copies. They were also produced with a tape, because a tape's not suitable these days, so that kids could listen to the story while they were looking at a book themselves and reading along with it. So it was another type of shared reading, but it wasn't the teacher, it was the tape doing it. And you can still make those sorts of things yourselves that children can read along with, especially with iPads these days. You can do just about anything with them.
In Don Holdaway's research, I was reading his book, Foundation for Literacy, or...
Oh, yes. What a brilliant book that is. Yeah. Absolutely brilliant.
Anyway, he was talking about, he observed children at home and they would be read to by the parent, but then they'd go off and play with some things in their room, but they'd often start drawing something that had been read to them. And there was just as much learning going on in that child's mind as when the book was read to them as the independent activity they were doing afterwards. There was a real connection between those two things.
That's right. And in fact, I did a lot of research in observing children who were being read to at home. And, when they were read these sorts of books that they loved, even from the time they were in the cot, they would pick up books and know to turn the pages and look through them. Yeah. And they actually loved choosing to do that as an independent activity. Yeah. I've got photos of 2 little brothers reading to each other long before they went to school. Yeah. And even originally, if they were making up the story, they were understanding what reading was about. Yeah. So it's, there are just so many benefits that no wonder Don was able to do so much research about it. Yeah. But passing on to the child doing it independently is an important part of this. Yeah. And I'm not sure that teachers who are using big books realise that at some stage the children then need to be independently also reading those books. It just doesn't stop with the shared reading.
It's doubly powerful when you let the kids read their own versions of that or do some artwork with it. Or Don Holdaway found there was just incredible learning going on in that independent time.
Yep. And, it's what we want to do all the time, is help children to learn to read so that they will read independently and know what they're doing. So it was just something that was so effective, the use of these books, but we've got to give the kids an opportunity to read them themselves. One of the things that amazes me, and I guess it's, again, a lack of understanding, but, these children at home would end up having perhaps, if they were in a home where the parents kept buying books, they might have 50 books that they loved and would just continually, for months and months, ask for the same ones to be read over and over again. Yeah. And yet in a classroom, I've seen the big book being used for a week and then taken out of the classroom and either put away or handed on to another teacher. Yeah. Now, it's not supposed to go anywhere. It's supposed to stay in the classroom. Yeah. Kids will come out and get the big book and sit down in pairs, and I've noticed kids are so clever. I saw one boy who was struggling a bit with reading, and he would purposely ask someone who was further along in their development as readers to come and read this big book with him. But he was able to use, the stronger reader's ability to read this independently to help him to read it. And I'd see him watch the other child when he'd come to parts that he wasn't sure of. So they want to be able to pick up this big book and read it themselves. And they also would prefer to also have some small copies.
Yep.
And if they're not produced in a small version, then you could produce your own in some way. So it is a real problem now that publishers are not doing it. So teachers are finding all sorts of innovative ways to get some small copies made.
Yeah, so that's a real philosophy behind this about children having a quality shared book and also that they have time to practice with it.
That's right. And in fact, Don Holdaway, who's unfortunately passed away now, but I can remember the last reading conference he spoke about. He actually talked about the worries he had about how big books were being used and people's misunderstanding of shared reading, that they thought it was just to be an enjoyable experience. Well, certainly if you've chosen the right book, the reading experience will be enjoyable, and that's one of the things you want to do. But that's not all there is to it. It's very well thought out and researched when you do the right sorts of things as part of that shared reading experience.
So it's a really amazing thing having the right text and getting that ready in the classroom. But there's so much more to shared reading, Di, isn't there? Like what happens when a text is introduced for shared reading? What does a teacher do?
Well, at first, and it's interesting, Don even talked about what he would like a shared reading session to be, that you would start off with something that the children can read, and it might just be a 4-line poem. I can remember him doing that with us as adults. Was My Mother Loves Me and I Love Her Too. But anyway, he wanted to start the shared reading session with something that we all in the class could read and feel successful as readers. So we're all going to start off this session feeling great about ourselves. And, some children don't think they're a reader, and so they, are frightened of even having a go at it. I came across one boy like that in the classroom yesterday, and I had to keep reinforcing for him the things that he was able to do. So, okay, we're off and running. We feel good about ourselves now. I'm introducing a new book to you, and there's a variety of things that you could do when you introduce a book. So it might be that you work out what the title is from the picture clues on the cover, or there's, you can see if the children know any of those words, or you can work out some of the words, whatever. And you might even look through the book to get some sense of what type of book it is and what's going to happen, or you might purposely not do that because you want the children to be predicting before, they come to the parts of the book we haven't got to yet. But don't take too long over that because, you've just got to keep moving on. The most important thing is for you and the children to read, not to talk too much. So I might read the title, we see what it might be about, and then we'll get into it. And I have with me a long, thin pointer. I do not have a pointer that is short, and my arm's going to cover the words as I use it, tracking along the print. It's not going to have some big blob on the end because I don't want to be covering any of the print. Long and thin. Even a long stick out of the garden is better than some of the bought fancy things that I see in classrooms. Because I want to track as closely as I can to the words. And there's a lot of things that can happen even with that tracking. I might start off when I'm first reading the book with just following along the line after line, do a return sweep line, turn sweep line, because at that stage perhaps children are just learning that's how reading occurs, left to right, top to bottom. And I want to read very fluently and with the right sort of expression. I don't want to read like a robot, which could happen if you point to each word, so you have to be careful. And the children are as close to me as possible, so that the way you even set up your room so that you've got a group area where the children can all gather into you and around the book as closely as possible. Not a long, thin group of kids where kids up the back are not really part of the community. And I even think about where I want some children to be sitting so that they'll be able to easily pay attention. All eyes on the book. And I'll read the book, just as an enjoyable experience and for us to see what it's about. The first time I tend mostly, particularly with beginning readers, to just read all the way through and then come back to it. And the second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th time, we may do many other things. But it's just to read it all first, enjoy a good story or a good piece of nonfiction. And then we will read it again. And I'm saying to the children, join in with me whenever you like, whenever you feel that you can join in.
Yep.
And I particularly want all children to feel so that if you are able to read with me straight away, we'll do so. If you're not, you're sitting there amongst a community of readers and you're gradually getting the hang of what it's about as we read it many times. But you're part of this community who are reading this book and they all feel okay about it. There's no... you can't join in because you can't read yet or whatever.
Yeah, it's not a deficit model. It's a positive model.
Exactly.
Yep.
And that might be all we do the first time. But, of course, we're going to return to that. And kids might interrupt and ask questions and make comments. That's fine. I'm not going to stop them because that's what, young kids before school will do. Except sometimes I do have to say when there's, 25 to 30 kids, first of all, let's just all listen to the story and then we'll come back and you can make comments. You've got to be sensitive about that. If you feel that some children are not being read to enough at home, you can have small groups with this shared reading experience, and that allows all the children to make comments and ask questions without being too much of an interruption to the others. And in fact, it's a really great use of any volunteer workers you have in your school to have them come and read to small groups. They might do a read aloud with another book, but doing a shared reading in a small group allows for much more interaction and the children to really feel like they're there on the parent's nap.
That's perfect use of helpers in the classroom, isn't it?
Oh, yes, it's a really good thing to do and something that I found parents to be just fabulous at doing. I can even be very thoughtful about it, who I choose. I might ask a male to come up and do shared reading with a group of boys because I know that some boys don't get that experience at home and they don't think of males as being readers. All those little things can make a difference. But we're going to now be able to use this text for lots of other things because even to be able to explore something like what sounds do I hear in a word and what letter do I notice or letters do I notice are representing that sound. To be able to hear sounds in a word, you've got to be able to say the word. And if this book is so familiar to you that you now can read the words, you're hearing the words, you're seeing the words, you're saying the words, and now you're even able to say the word and listen for sounds in the word to be able to explore that very important aspect of reading. When I come to look at a particular letter or letters, how will I say them? This is the phonics teaching that we need to do.
And this leads me into the question, why is shared reading an important practice in the teaching of reading? It's an absolutely rich resource to do this, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is. And again, it gets back to the right sort of text, remember. But, every text is going to have words in it, words I can listen to and find sounds in words and rhymes and RIMES. And, we can use this text that we now are familiar with to go on and do anything we like in the teaching of reading. And we might want to talk about what all of those things are a little bit later. But it's such a rich resource. And it's been found to be particularly useful for children whose first language is not English because this hearing the language, seeing the language, and then joining in with the language is such an important way to help them learn English if it's not their first language. And then, of course, to be going on from that to do so much more about learning how to read and write, of course, because we're readers, you can become writers. So that's why it's not just an add-on in the classroom. We have read aloud for a particular purpose, and that might be because the children can't read this yet, but we want them to hear rich language, vocabulary, so many ideas and so forth, and build up world knowledge. So we read aloud, but the children can't see the print. And the advantage with shared reading is they're seeing the print while you're saying it. How strong is that?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
And then they're joining in with it. So even that beginning learning to make that one-to-one match with what I'm saying matches this print here, which is such an important concept of print for the kids to develop when they're beginning to learn to read. Yep. I've got to have some sort of print that we can follow along with and make those matches. I can take sentences from that shared reading book, cut them up into words, rematch them against the sentence, and then the next level of difficulty of that would be not to start with the sentence, but just to have the words from a sentence and have the children put them together so that it makes sense. It has the right syntax, and then match it against the sentence from the book to see if you were correct. And, of course, every time you do something like that, you then read it. So everything that you can follow on with, there should be some more reading involved, not just talk. You know, I've actually seen a young teacher work all the way through a big book talking about comprehension type questions, and the children never read the book.
Yep.
So, you know, we've got to remember that the fundamental reason for this is we're helping children learn to read. And certainly we want to teach them about comprehension, but not to the point where the kids don't actually get to read.
Yep. It's got to be a really enjoyable experience in this shared reading, doesn't it? Yep.
Oh, for sure. Otherwise, how are you going to keep them involved and sustained? And, you know, I can remember, again, it's someone who unfortunately passed away a while ago, and I'm pretty sure his name was Lawson, and I can't remember what his first name was, but he was actually observing the parent in the home situation. You know, sometimes the parent would just read one book to their child, and then it's time for sleep. In other homes, and this is what I observed too, the parents would read to the children for quite a while. Yep. And I understand that time is important for parents too, especially if they've got lots of other things to be doing. But these children who were read to for sustained periods of time, when they came to school, they were able to remain sustained in anything that was happening in the classroom, in any content area. So it's developing that ability to remain involved and sustained in something for a while that shared reading can do as well.
So we've answered this one a little bit. So what does all this mean for shared reading in the school setting with a teacher and a class of students? And you've covered a few of those things, but we might emphasise that the students joining in with the reading with the big book is a really important thing that Don Holdaway professed. Oh,
the joining in, you know, again, I've seen teachers who've just read to the children or thought they needed to read parts of it and the children would read parts. It might start out like that, but the goal is for the children to be able to join in with all of the reading, which is why the selecting of books that are going to be suitable for your children
so important.
Is going to be so important. I know my class, I know what they can read. What do I think they'll be able to join in with after I've read it 2 or 3 times? So at first they may not be able to, but if it's so difficult, so far beyond what they're up to, that they're not going to be able to join in, then it's not suitable for those children. And again, I help teachers go through the collection and say, okay, in our collection of big books and poems, etc., that we're using for shared reading, which would we use at the beginning of the first year at school, the prep year, the foundation year? What might we be using by the end of that year? What will we be using at the beginning of grade 1? And, you know, things happen over that long Christmas break. We probably, from my experience, definitely need to go back to the books that they were reading at the end of the first year at school so that we might be starting with something a little bit familiar, but they really need to be rereading those. And then I will be thinking about what's a little bit more difficult. And, of course, there are all sorts of things that make something easy or difficult to read. And you know your readers, so you'll be knowing what to use. But it even means you think about how your big books are collected or kept in a school. And quite often I'll see them all in somewhere like the school library or a storeroom, and they're hanging on some sort of hanging thing, and they're in alphabetical order because that will be easy to find the title. But, you know, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy for you as a teacher to find the books that are appropriate for your children, whether you're in preps or you're in grade 2 or grade 4. And so that's the first sorting of those books. And where do they need to be? They need to be either in the classroom where they're going to be used or very close for those teachers to be able to get the books easily, not over in some part of the school, the library or storeroom or something. Now, it doesn't mean you've got them all out at once. A parent doesn't, introduce the child to 50 books all at once, but you've got the one you're going to be using now, and that's going to stay in your room, and then you're going to be introducing another one. So you've now got 2 of these books in your room. Then you'll be introducing a third one, and I'll still be reading books 1 and 2, and now I'm also reading book 3. So it doesn't mean every day I'm going to read every one of those, but just like at home where the children want those books to be handy and go back and choose their favourites and want them read again and joining in with the reading, those books are collecting. And it may not only be books, it'll be poems and songs on the language experience books that you make yourself about your own children's experiences. They can all be used for shared reading. And so Don Holdaway would say by the end of perhaps the 3rd week of school, the children could probably read at least 10 things.
Yep.
10 texts might be a poem and 3 songs and a nursery rhyme and a chant and 5 different big books. And so this idea that I just use a book once and then I don't use that anymore and I pass it on to someone else is totally against what shared reading is about if you want to do it effectively and get the greatest benefit out of it.
So it's understanding what the philosophy is behind it.
Exactly.
That's
a
how
parent does not read a book to a child and then give it away to somebody else.
No.
Do they? So I think it's really wise to just keep thinking about what is the real situation, the most effective way that a parent can read books to their children. What do they choose? And it's fascinating to me that, parents are still buying the books of Eric Carle that were published 50 years ago because they're still great books to read, very suitable for shared reading, etc.
Yep.
But not with tiny print at school,
No.
right? So if I actually bought a large copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar and it had tiny print in it, I would paste some paper over the print and write a larger print version.
Yep.
That makes sense?
Yep.
Or I would have to just use the book for read aloud.
Yep.
Because the children will not be able to read along with me.
Yep.
Keep thinking about common sense,
Yep.
and it will make you realise, what is going to be the most effective thing to do. It's just not common sense to read a book for a week and then give it away.
And so much is about motivation and enjoyment, isn't it? Like those people that originally wrote those nursery rhymes and fairy tales and whatever were really trying to motivate kids, weren't they? Really.
Oh, definitely.
Engage
sure.
them. And
yep. I don't think anyone purposely writes a book that's not very interesting to read. But if you have some other different purpose for reading it, something you want the children to practice or whatever, then it's probably not going to be the book that the children will say, read it again.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then regardless of what else you might think it's doing to help kids reading, it's certainly not suitable for shared reading.
No. And we'll take a break there from part 1 of our podcast. We look forward to you joining us for part 2. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.